Alright, so if you are watching this video, that is because you need to have a little bit of a review of the distributive property. So we're going to give you that review really quick. I'm going to first start by giving you the definition of the distributive property. So if you look at these letters that are coming up on your screen, it says A times the quantity of B plus C equals A times B plus A times C. Now, that looks pretty complicated when it's written like that, and some of you may have already seen it written like this before, but basically all that means is you take the outside term and you multiply it by every single term that's inside the parentheses. So right now that A is what's outside, and we've got B plus C inside. So I take A and multiply it by B, and then I take A and multiply it by C. I keep that plus sign in between the two terms. And that's all that definition means. Now a couple things I'm going to tell you that might help you as we're doing these problems that you might want to jot down is that x times x is x squared. Now that's going to come up all the time, and I can replace that with y times y is y squared, or p times p is p squared, but you're often going to need to multiply a variable times itself. So make sure you know that. If you're multiplying a number by a number with a variable, you've got to multiply the coefficients, which is the numbers, first. So 2 times 6 in this example is 12, and then you keep that variable attached to your final term. So 2 times 6 is 12, and that x comes along for the ride. If I multiply two variables that are different, so if I multiply x times y, it'll come out to be xy or yx. It's not going to have a squared on it because I can't combine those two. So keep that in mind. You could write it either way with either variable first, and it means the same thing. And the last step I want to make sure you notice is to be careful with negatives. Always, whether it's inside the parentheses or if it's on the number that's outside the parentheses, be careful with those negatives. Make sure you're watching that. Alright, the first example that I'm going to show you is 3 times 2x minus 4 in parentheses. So I take that 3, and if you look at that red arrow, I multiply it times 2x first, and that's how I get 6x. Now here's an example of where I've got to be careful with a negative that's inside the parentheses. So I'm just going to rewrite that negative right underneath, and then do 3 times 4 with that purple arrow to get 12. Now you could also think about it as 3 times negative 4 would give me negative 12, and you could also look at it that way to get your final answer. Let's do another example. Now this one has a negative out in the front, and we're looking at a couple different kinds of variables here. So my term out in the front is negative 2y, and I'm going to have to multiply that by x, positive y, and negative 1. So let's take a look at what that does. So the first thing that I do is I take negative 2y and multiply it by x. I'm going to write that as negative 2xy. I could also write that as negative 2yx. And then I'm going to take that negative 2, and I'm going to multiply it, negative 2y, and I'm going to multiply it by positive y. Now a positive times a negative gives me that negative that I have in pink in front of this 2y squared. Now this time I take that negative 2 and I bring it down. And then I multiply y times y to give me y squared because they're both the same variable. Now the last thing you've got to do is be really careful with these negatives because I've got a negative on my 2, then I've got a negative on my 1, so I'm actually going to get a positive 2y for my last term when I multiply with that green arrow. Now the last thing I want you to do before you try that quiz again is to try that problem that you got wrong that got you here. Okay, so the problem that you got wrong was 6x times 2x plus 3. So on your own, try and figure out what the right answer should have been, and then when you're ready, start the video up again. So pause it, write down the right answer, and then when you're ready, start it back up and check to make sure that you did it correctly. So if you did this problem correctly, you should have multiplied 6 times 2 to get 12 and x times x to get x squared, and then you should have multiplied 6 times 3 to get 18 and carried that x down to get 18x. Now there's no negatives in this problem, so it's actually not too tricky. You don't have too much to keep track of. Hopefully that helped really quick just to go through some examples of the distributive property. Now go ahead and try that next question.